On our anniversary, the house was full in the quiet, practiced way it always was when Alex's family gathered. Voices stayed low. Plates were passed carefully. Nothing looked unusual, until I heard the word passport spoken as casually as dessert. They were seated around the dining table, leaning in just enough to sound important, but not enough to look secretive. Someone mentioned forms. Someone else mentioned a timeline. Alex nodded the way he always did when he thought everything was under control. I assumed at first that they were talking about his work trip, another project, another excuse that made sense on the surface. Then I heard a sentence that didn't belong to me. "She'll need everything ready before the flight." No one looked at me when it was said. No one corrected it, no one explained. The conversation didn't pause, didn't soften, didn't shift the way it would have if they realized they had said too much. They kept going, confident and relaxed, as if the woman they were preparing documents for was an agreed-upon fact. I didn't ask who she was. I didn't interrupt. I didn't react. They talked about appointments, about processing times, about how complicated it was to rush paperwork without drawing attention. They spoke like people who had already rehearsed this conversation many times before. And I sat there, anniversary ring on my finger, listening as my husband and his family planned a future that didn't include me. I remember thinking very clearly that this was the moment they believed their plan was perfect. Dinner ended the way it always did. Plates were cleared, chairs scraped softly against the floor. Someone mentioned how quickly time had passed. Alex squeezed my shoulder in that familiar, distracted way and asked if I was tired. I said I was fine. That was the truth. I wasn't tired. I was alert in a way I hadn't been in years. After everyone moved into the living room, the conversation didn't stop. It simply continued without ceremony, as if I were part of the furniture. Passports came up again. So did flights. Dates were mentioned. Not directly, but close enough that I could feel them circling. What struck me most wasn't the secrecy, it was the confidence. They weren't whispering. They weren't checking to see if I was listening. No one worried that I might ask the wrong question or notice the wrong detail. In their minds, I was exactly where I had always been. The wife who didn't interfere, the woman who trusted, the person who signed what she was told to sign, and stayed quiet to keep the peace. I had spent nearly 8 years becoming that woman. Alex's mother mentioned needing copies of identification. His sister said she'd handle the appointments. Someone else brought up finances in vague, careful language, the kind that avoided numbers but still carried weight. I sat on the edge of the couch and folded my hands in my lap, nodding occasionally the way I always did. At one point, Alex glanced at me and smiled. It was the smile he used when he thought everything was settled. "It's nothing you need to worry about," he said lightly, not explaining what it was. I smiled back. That was when I understood that whatever they were planning didn't rely on my agreement. It relied on my silence. I watched them the way you watch a performance once you know how it ends. I noticed who spoke with authority and who deferred. I noticed how quickly they corrected one another when a detail was off. I noticed that no one, not once, asked what I thought. That absence was louder than any confession. I didn't feel anger right away. What I felt was distance. A clean, emotional step backward that allowed me to see the shape of things more clearly than I ever had. This wasn't just about Alex. This wasn't even just about infidelity. This was a coordinated effort, a family decision, a future being assembled piece by piece, using resources that did not belong to them alone. And still I said nothing. I didn't excuse myself. I didn't leave the room. I didn't let my face harden or my voice change. I stayed exactly where I was, present enough to be harmless, quiet enough to be forgotten. Because in that moment I realized something they hadn't considered. They believed my silence meant ignorance. They believed my calm meant consent. And they believed, above all else, that I would never understand what they were really doing. They were wrong. After the anniversary dinner ended, the house didn't quiet down the way it usually did. Conversations drifted from the table to the living room, lowered just enough to sound private but not enough to feel hidden. I stayed where I was, collecting empty glasses, folding napkins, moving the way someone moves when they are expected to be useful and unobtrusive. That was when I heard it again. Not a name, not a face, just a pronoun. She'll need the copies by Friday. There was no hesitation in the sentence. No one asked who she was. No one clarified. It was spoken with the ease of something already agreed upon, something that no longer required explanation. I paused with a plate in my hands, long enough to confirm that the word hadn't been meant for me. It hadn't. I finished what I was doing and joined them on the couch, sitting slightly apart, as I always did when Alex's family gathered. They continued talking, their voices weaving around me as if I were part of the room rather than the conversation. I noticed how careful they were not to say her name and how unnecessary it seemed to be. Everyone knew exactly who they meant. That was the first thing that made my stomach tighten. If this had been a sudden affair, there would have been confusion, hesitation, slips. Instead, there was coordination, a shared understanding that didn't require words. They had moved past secrecy into routine, and routine meant time. I listened as they discussed appointments and paperwork, how long certain processes usually took, how frustrating it was to rush anything official without raising flags. Alex's sister mentioned a deadline. His mother corrected her gently. Someone else laughed and said they'd handled worse before. Handled worse. No one looked at me. At some point, Alex stood to pour himself a drink and asked if I wanted anything. His tone was light, affectionate even, the way it always was when he thought there were no complications. I said no, thanked him, and watched him return to the group. The conversation resumed without missing a beat. I started paying closer attention to the details. The dates they mentioned didn't align with Alex's work schedule. The documents they referenced didn't match anything we had ever needed before. One form, briefly laid out on the coffee table, had a birth date that wasn't his. Another required information I knew didn't apply to me. These weren't my papers. That realization settled slowly, like something heavy finding its place. I didn't touch the documents. I didn't take a closer look. I didn't need to. The gaps were obvious once I allowed myself to see them. Whoever they were preparing this for was younger, unattached, someone whose future didn't require explanation or compromise. Someone unburdened by a wife sitting 3 feet away. What struck me most was how openly they assigned roles. Alex handled the finances. His sister coordinated appointments. His mother kept track of timelines and contingencies. Each of them spoke with confidence, as if this were a group project they had volunteered for willingly. No one questioned whether it was right. No one questioned whether it was legal. And no one questioned whether I should be involved. I realized then that this wasn't something Alex had confessed to his family and asked for help with. This was something they had helped him build. They weren't reacting, they were executing. That understanding changed the shape of everything. I had imagined, in the abstract way people imagine betrayal, that if it ever happened to me, it would feel like a single sharp moment. A discovery, a confrontation, a collapse. Instead, it felt like standing in a room where everyone else had already read the script. They weren't worried about my reaction because they didn't consider it relevant. I had spent years being agreeable, years deferring decisions because it was easier, years letting Alex manage what he said he understood better. Somewhere along the way, that trust had hardened into an assumption. That I wouldn't look too closely, and even if I did, I wouldn't act. They mistook patience for incapacity. As the evening wore on, the conversation grew looser. Someone joked about how complicated international logistics could be. Someone else complained about how expensive everything had become. The tone was almost celebratory, like people preparing for a fresh start. I felt something shift inside me then, not pain, not rage, just clarity. This wasn't about me being left behind emotionally. This was about me being erased practically. Plans were being made using assets that belonged to both of us. Futures were being drawn without my consent, and everyone involved seemed comfortable with that fact. I stayed until the last coat was taken from the closet. I hugged Alex's mother goodnight. I smiled at his sister. I thanked them for coming. I did everything a good wife was expected to do. When the door finally closed and the house fell quiet, Alex exhaled like someone who had finished a long task. He asked if I had enjoyed myself. I said yes. That was another truth. I had enjoyed the clarity. Lying in bed later, I didn't replay what they had said. I replayed what they hadn't. No one had worried about explaining anything to me. No one had asked whether I would agree. No one had considered the possibility that I was listening, understanding, and choosing what to do with that understanding. I turned onto my side and stared into the dark, fully aware now of what was happening. Alex wasn't just planning to leave. He was planning to leave cleanly. And everyone else was helping him believe he could. I didn't confront Alex the next morning, or the morning after that. I moved through the house the way I always had, making coffee, answering emails, folding laundry, listening to the familiar rhythms of a life that suddenly felt like evidence. What I couldn't ignore anymore was how natural all of this felt to him, how easily my absence from his plans had become normal. That realization pulled other memories to the surface, not as flashes or scenes, but as a slow understanding. This hadn't started last night. It hadn't started with a passport or a flight. It had started years ago, quietly, with the words he used whenever money came up. "I understand this stuff better," he used to say, always gently, always with a reassuring smile. "It's just easier if I handle it." In the beginning, I had agreed without hesitation. We were newly married. We trusted each other. I was working in sales then, long hours, constant pressure. Letting him manage the finances felt like a relief, not a surrender. I told myself it was teamwork. He opened the accounts. He chose the banks. He explained things just enough for me to nod along. When papers needed signing, he slid them across the table and pointed to where my name went. "Standard stuff," he said more than once. "Nothing you need to worry about." I believed him. Over time, that pattern settled into something permanent. Decisions were made before I knew they existed. Conversations happened elsewhere, then arrived in front of me already resolved. If I asked a question, it was answered quickly, smoothly, with a tone that suggested I was being looked after. And I let it happen, because letting it happen kept things calm. His family praised me for it. They called me easygoing, sensible, low maintenance. I smiled when they said it, unaware that those words were slowly being translated into something else. Quiet became uninformed. Cooperative became irrelevant. There were moments I remembered now with uncomfortable clarity. Sitting at the kitchen table, pen in my hand, skimming dense paragraphs while Alex checked his phone. Pausing on a clause I didn't fully understand, only to hear him say, "It's just legal language. Everyone has this." I had trusted that he wouldn't put me at risk. I hadn't been forced. That was the part that stung the most. I had chosen not to push, not to insist, not to read more carefully. Each time, it felt like a small compromise. Each time, it moved the boundary a little farther away from me. As the years passed, the balance shifted almost imperceptibly. Alex stopped discussing long-term plans unless they directly involved his work. Financial decisions became updates rather than conversations. I was informed, not consulted. At the time, I told myself this was what stability looked like. Now, in the quiet after that anniversary dinner, I saw it differently. Control didn't arrive with cruelty. It arrived with convenience. It wrapped itself in responsibility and good intentions until it became invisible. I thought about the way his family had spoken the night before. How confidently they moved through details that should have required my input. How certain they were that I wouldn't interfere. That certainty hadn't come from nowhere. It had been earned. I went back through our files that afternoon, not searching yet, just touching the edges of things. The folder where we kept house documents, the drawer with bank statements and insurance policies. Everything was neatly organized, labeled in Alex's handwriting. I remembered how proud he had been of that system. "See," he'd said once, "everything's taken care of." What struck me wasn't what I saw, but how rarely I had looked. There was a moment, years earlier, when I had hesitated over a document related to our home. I remembered it clearly now. A paragraph about asset movement that made me pause. I had asked Alex what it meant. He had smiled, kissed my forehead, and said it was a formality, something required by the lender. I had signed. That memory stayed with me as I closed the drawer. They hadn't expected me to understand what was happening now because they believed I never had. In their eyes, I was consistent, predictable. the woman who kept the peace by trusting the people around her to know better. What they didn't see was that trust, once broken, didn't turn into anger right away. It turned into attention. By the third day after the anniversary, I felt different moving through the world. Not lighter, not freer, but sharper. I listened more carefully. I noticed how Alex spoke when he thought I wasn't paying attention. I noticed how often my name was left out of conversations that affected my life. I wasn't hurt in the way I had imagined betrayal would feel. I was focused. Somewhere between remembering all the times I had stepped back and recognizing where that had led me, a decision formed. It didn't come with drama or resolve. It came quietly, like a door closing. If they believed I was incapable of understanding what they were doing, I would let that belief stand. But I would no longer protect it. I didn't need to raise my voice or demand answers. I needed to read what I had signed, understand the rules they thought only they knew, and decide what silence would mean this time. Because silence, I was beginning to realize, could be chosen. And when it was, it changed everything. Silence stopped being something that happened to me and became something I chose. I didn't announce it. I didn't mark the moment with any visible change. I simply decided that whatever came next would not begin with confrontation. I had learned enough to know that questions would only warn them. Anger would only tighten their grip. If I wanted to understand the full shape of what was happening, I needed to stay exactly where they expected me to be. Invisible, agreeable, quiet. So I stayed. I cooked dinner. I asked Alex about his day. I listened while he talked about work with the same confidence he always used when he thought he was in control. When his phone buzzed, I didn't look up. When he stepped into the other room to take a call, I didn't follow. Nothing about my behavior suggested suspicion. And because of that, everything continued to happen in front of me. Conversations resumed with less caution. The tension I had felt at the anniversary dinner dissolved into efficiency. Plans moved forward. Timelines tightened. I heard fragments while passing through rooms, while standing at the sink, while folding clothes in the next room. They spoke around me, not to me, and that made all the difference. I began to notice patterns. Money moved in ways it hadn't before, not dramatically, not enough to trigger alarms, but with intention. Certain accounts were accessed more frequently. Expenses appeared that didn't align with our usual rhythms. Nothing reckless, everything calculated. I didn't check balances directly. I didn't log into anything or leave a digital trail that could be noticed. I simply paid attention to timing. When transfers happened, when Alex seemed unusually relaxed afterward, when conversations about cost suddenly stopped. It was clear that this wasn't about a temporary trip. They were preparing for permanence. The logistics became harder to ignore. There were discussions about where things would be stored, what could be left behind, what needed to be settled quietly before departure. Alex's sister spoke once about how complicated it was to clean things up before moving across borders. His mother responded with reassurance, saying they had thought of everything. Everything except the person they were speaking in front of. What struck me wasn't their cruelty, it was their certainty. They believed the structure they had built was airtight. They believed the systems they were using were theirs alone to navigate. And most of all, they believed that I was not someone who would ever question that. That belief protected them. It also exposed them. I realized then why Alex hadn't pushed me away or grown distant in obvious ways. He needed me close. He needed the appearance of stability. A wife at home made everything else easier. It explained his absences. It softened questions. It made the transition look clean. I wasn't a complication to be removed yet. I was camouflage. Understanding that changed how I listened. I stopped reacting emotionally and started mapping what I heard. Who spoke when? Who deferred? Who confirmed decisions? Alex wasn't acting alone, but he wasn't the architect either. This was a collective effort, shaped by shared confidence and reinforced by years of my compliance. They weren't hiding from me because they didn't think they had to. And they were right in one crucial way. I didn't need to interrupt them. The more comfortable they became, the more careless they were. Details that would have been guarded early on were now discussed openly. Dates were adjusted, assumptions were stated aloud. They trusted that if something mattered, they would have told me. They trusted wrong. At night, lying next to Alex, I stared at the ceiling and replayed the day in my mind, not with hurt, but with analysis. I wasn't building a case yet. I was building understanding. I wanted to know exactly how they thought this would end. They thought it would end quietly. A clean break. Assets divided without scrutiny. A future rearranged without resistance. They believed that silence had always worked in their favor, and there was no reason to think it wouldn't continue to. What they didn't understand was that silence changes meaning when it is no longer passive. I wasn't staying quiet to keep the peace anymore. I was staying quiet to see the full picture. Every unchecked assumption they made about me added another advantage to my side. Every conversation they had without lowering their voices gave me more clarity. By the end of that week, I no longer felt like I was reacting to betrayal. I felt like I was studying a system from the inside. And I could see its weakness. They were using rules they assumed only they understood. Legal structures, financial pathways, procedures designed to move things efficiently without attention. Those systems weren't built to protect honesty. They were built to protect order, which meant they worked just as well in reverse. I didn't need to invent anything new. I didn't need to threaten or expose or accuse. I needed to understand the framework they were relying on and locate the points they had ignored, because they believed no one else would ever look. By the time Alex mentioned casually that things were finally coming together, I knew exactly what he meant. I smiled and told him that was good. And in that moment, my silence stopped being a shield for his plan and became the space where my own began to form. They believed silence meant compliance. I let them believe that. Because the quieter I became, the less they saw what I was really doing. I realized there had been a meeting without me long before I heard it. It was in the way the house felt different when I walked in that afternoon, quieter but charged, like a room after a decision has already been made. Shoes were lined up by the door that didn't belong to us. Voices drifted from the kitchen, low and deliberate. I set my bag down and moved slowly, not announcing myself, not trying to listen, just present enough to be overlooked. They were already mid-conversation. Not the careful kind they used when something was uncertain, but the settled kind, where details were being checked off rather than debated. Dates were confirmed. Someone mentioned what still needed to be handled. Another voice replied that it was already taken care of. No one asked who would tell me. I stood just outside the kitchen, close enough to hear, far enough to remain unseen. The realization came quietly, without shock. This wasn't a discussion. It was a continuation. Whatever doubts might have existed had been resolved somewhere else, at some other time, without me. Alex's voice was steady, confident. His sister asked about timing. His mother corrected her, reminding everyone that rushing too much would attract attention. The word attention hung in the air for a moment before someone laughed it off. They spoke like people who had rehearsed this. What struck me wasn't that they were planning. It was how naturally they divided responsibility. One person handled documents, another coordinated appointments. Alex focused on finances, assuring them that everything would be moved cleanly, quietly. There was no tension between them, no disagreement about priorities. They were aligned, and I was not part of that alignment. I took a step back, my heart steady, my breathing even. The old version of me would have walked in then, announced my presence, asked what was going on. That version would have demanded explanations and been fed half-truths in return. This version stayed still. I listened as they talked about what needed to be settled before departure. Storage, accounts, loose ends. Someone asked if there was anything else to consider. Alex said no, and no one challenged him. The assumption was clear. Everything that mattered was already accounted for. Everything except me. That was when I understood why my silence had been so valuable to them. It wasn't just that they didn't fear my reaction. It was that my presence, unchanged and unquestioning, allowed them to believe there were no risks left to manage. I was the proof they pointed to, even unconsciously, that their plan was safe. A compliant wife meant no complications. I heard my name mentioned once briefly in a way that barely registered. Not in concern, not in warning, just as a logistical note. Alex said something about how it was better if I didn't know details. Someone agreed, saying it would only create unnecessary stress. Unnecessary for whom was never specified. I felt the last of my uncertainty fall away then. This wasn't betrayal born of impulse or weakness. This was a deliberate exclusion, reinforced by a family that had decided, collectively, that my role was to stay quiet and absorb the outcome. What they didn't realize was that by excluding me from the conversation, they had also excluded me from obligation. I stepped away before anyone noticed I had been there at all. I moved through the house, poured myself a glass of water, and sat at the table as if nothing unusual had happened. When they emerged from the kitchen a few minutes later, their expressions were relaxed, almost relieved. The meeting was over. Alex smiled at me and asked if I'd eaten. I said I wasn't hungry. He nodded, distracted, his mind already elsewhere. No one looked guilty. No one seemed concerned that I might have overheard anything worth hiding. They believed privacy had protected them. What protected them, I realized, was my reputation. For years, I had been the person who didn't interrupt, the person who trusted, the person who accepted explanations without asking for more. That history worked in their favor now, blinding them to the fact that silence could also be strategic. I went about the rest of the day exactly as expected. I folded laundry, I answered emails. I asked Alex what time he'd be home for dinner. My voice didn't shake, my hands didn't tremble. Inside, something had shifted permanently. They had crossed a line they didn't even know existed. It wasn't the affair. It wasn't the plan to leave. It was the decision to use what belonged to both of us without my consent, to coordinate behind my back with the confidence that I would never notice or matter. That decision carried consequences, whether they understood them or not. That night, as Alex slept beside me, I stared into the darkness and replayed the meeting I was never meant to hear, not with bitterness, but with clarity. Every role they had assigned themselves, every assumption they had made about me. They believed I was not part of the equation. They were wrong. And the fact that I hadn't interrupted their meeting, hadn't revealed myself, hadn't challenged a single word they said, meant that when the consequences arrived, they would have no idea where they had come from. I didn't need to stop their plan. I just needed to let it continue exactly as they intended. Because the more confident they became in their secrecy, the deeper they stepped into a situation they no longer controlled. And I was the only one in that house who could see it happening. I went back to the files the way you return to a place you once trusted without question, now aware of every corner you never bothered to examine. They were exactly where Alex had always kept them. Neatly labeled folders, tabs in his handwriting. Everything arranged to look responsible, orderly, complete. I sat at the dining table and opened them one by one, not searching yet, just reading, slowly, deliberately, letting the language speak for itself. I had signed so many of these pages without hesitation. Mortgage documents, joint accounts, amendments and addenda that arrived years after the originals, each explained to me as routine. Each one presented at a moment when pushing back would have felt unnecessary, even ungrateful. I read them differently now. Legal language doesn't shout. It hides. It buries intention beneath precision and lets people believe that what matters will always be pointed out to them. I traced paragraphs with my finger, stopping at commas, rereading sentences that once slid past me because someone I trusted had said they were nothing. Some of it was, in fact, nothing. Standard clauses, expected disclosures. But mixed among them were choices, provisions that didn't need to be there unless someone anticipated a specific outcome. I felt the shift when I reached one of the later documents tied to our home. It was a supplemental agreement, added years after the purchase, written in the same neutral tone as everything else. I remembered signing it at the kitchen counter while Alex talked about refinancing options. I remembered hesitating for a moment, sensing something unfamiliar in the wording, and asking him what it meant. "It's just a safeguard," he'd said, already distracted. "Lenders require it sometimes." I had believed him. Now I read it again slower this time. The clause wasn't dramatic. It didn't threaten. It didn't accuse. It simply outlined conditions under which assets could be reviewed if there was evidence of concealment, misrepresentation, or transfer intended to bypass shared ownership, particularly across jurisdictions, across borders. I read it once more, then again, letting the implications settle. This wasn't a loophole, it wasn't an oversight. It was a mechanism, dormant unless triggered by behavior specific enough to activate it. Behavior like the kind I had been listening to for weeks. What struck me wasn't that the clause existed. It was that no one thought I would ever notice it. Alex hadn't hidden it from me. He hadn't needed to. He had relied on the version of me who didn't read past reassurance. I understood then why he hadn't been careful lately, why the family meeting had happened so openly, why money had started moving with more urgency. They believed the paperwork protected them. They believed the structure favored the people who understood it best. They didn't consider that understanding could change hands. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel angry. What I felt was a sudden stillness, the kind that comes when a puzzle clicks into place. Everything I had seen, the passports, the timelines, the coordination, now had context. This wasn't about catching him in a lie. It was about letting the consequences of his actions unfold without interference. I read the clause until I could recite it in my head. Not the words, but the logic. What it required. What it didn't. There was no need for confrontation, no demand for proof beyond documented behavior, no requirement that I accuse anyone of anything. All it required was submission through the proper channel. No raised voice, no explanation, just procedure. That was the moment I stopped feeling small. For years, I had believed that my role in our marriage was defined by compromise, that staying quiet was a form of kindness, that trust meant not insisting on understanding every detail. I saw now how easily that belief had been used to sideline me. Not through force, but through assumption. They assumed I wouldn't read. They assumed I wouldn't question. They assumed that even if I did, I wouldn't act. I closed the folder and sat back, letting the silence settle around me. Alex was still at work. The house was empty. No one was watching. There was nothing urgent to do yet. That mattered. If I acted too quickly, it would look reactive. If I acted emotionally, it would invite negotiation. The strength of what I had found lay in its neutrality. It didn't belong to me as a weapon. It belonged to the system as a response. I needed to let them finish what they were doing. That night, Alex mentioned that things were moving faster than expected. He sounded relieved, almost excited. I nodded, asked if he wanted dinner early or late. He didn't notice my hands were steady. I didn't mention the files. I didn't mention the clause. I didn't even mention that I had spent the afternoon reading documents we both supposedly owned. There was no reason to. By the time I went to bed, the decision had already been made. Not in anger, not in desperation, just in recognition of a line that had been crossed quietly and deliberately. They believed the papers protected them. They never considered who else those papers could protect. And when the moment came to use them, I wouldn't need to explain myself. I would only need to follow the rules they thought only they understood. I did not confront him. That decision settled into me with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting there all along. Confrontation would have changed the temperature of the room. It would have sharpened his attention, forced him into caution. I needed the opposite. I needed him comfortable. So I let him believe nothing had changed. Mornings continued the same way they always had. Coffee brewed. Keys landed in the same bowl by the door. Alex talked about work, about deadlines, about how exhausting everything was. I listened, nodded, asked the right questions. When he mentioned upcoming travel, I didn't flinch. The absence of resistance did exactly what I expected. He relaxed. Without suspicion to manage, he grew careless. Details slipped out more easily, timelines shortened. Plans that had once been vague became specific. He spoke more freely around me, assuming I was half listening at best, distracted by the routine of our life. It was remarkable how quickly confidence turned into negligence. His family followed his lead. Conversations that had once paused when I entered a room now continued uninterrupted. They no longer lowered their voices. The secrecy they had maintained early on dissolved into efficiency. They were too close to the finish line to worry about an obstacle they believed didn't exist. I noticed how often Alex checked his phone, not with nervousness, but with anticipation. Messages came and went. Calls were returned promptly. The tone of his voice carried certainty, the sound of someone who believed the outcome was already secured. That certainty was my advantage. I stayed exactly as I had always been. I didn't ask for access to accounts. I didn't request explanations. I didn't change my schedule or my habits. Every choice I made reinforced the version of me they had come to rely on. Predictable, passive, harmless. There were moments when speaking would have been easy, when a single question could have unraveled everything. Once Alex mentioned that he was surprised by how smoothly things were going. He laughed and said it felt like luck was finally on his side. I smiled and told him he deserved it. Inside, I noted the date he mentioned without asking him to repeat it. The closer they came to departure, the faster they moved. Appointments were confirmed, documents were collected, loose ends were tied off with increasing urgency. This acceleration told me something important. They believed there was no longer any risk. They had stopped hiding. That was when I knew the timing was nearly right. At night, lying beside Alex, I felt the strange calm that comes from knowing you are no longer guessing. There was nothing left to uncover, no secret waiting to surprise me. Everything that mattered had already revealed itself. The risk, I understood, wasn't in waiting, it was in acting too soon. If I interrupted now, they would retreat, they would delay, they would adjust. I needed them fully committed, fully invested, moving forward without hesitation. The mechanism I planned to use depended on their momentum. Silence was the final test. There was a moment, a few days before everything was set to happen, when Alex looked at me with something like relief. He told me he appreciated how understanding I had been lately. He said it made everything easier. I told him I was glad. He didn't hear what I didn't say. What he mistook for understanding was distance. What he mistook for trust was observation. I wasn't sharing the burden of his plan. I was letting it reach its full weight. By the time his family gathered again to finalize details, they spoke openly in front of me. Names of cities, general timelines, the tone of people already imagining themselves elsewhere. No one checked my expression. They didn't need to. I had passed every test they never knew they were administering. That night, after Alex fell asleep, I lay awake and considered the risk one last time. Once the next step was taken, there would be no opportunity for quiet negotiation. No space for explanation or revision. The process I intended to set in motion wouldn't respond to emotion. That was its strength. They believed nothing could stop them now. Every sign around them reinforced that belief. I had done nothing to challenge it. If anything, I had helped it grow. When Alex kissed me goodbye the next morning and said things were finally coming together, I kissed him back and told him I was happy for him. He left the house convinced his plan was perfect. He didn't realize that perfection at this stage meant commitment. And commitment meant that when the illusion finally broke, there would be nothing left to fix. I waited until the house was empty. Alex had left early, distracted and confident, already mentally elsewhere. The silence that followed felt deliberate, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I sat at the dining table with the folder open in front of me, the same one I had read and reread until the language no longer felt foreign. This was the only move I would make. Not a message, not a confrontation, not a warning. I wasn't about to step into their story and demand a role. I was going to step out of it and let the structure they trusted do the speaking for me. I followed the process exactly as it was written. Every instruction mattered, the order, the wording, the attachments. There was no room for improvisation, and I didn't need any. The clause didn't ask me how I felt. It didn't ask me to prove betrayal or explain intent. It responded to behavior that had already crossed a line. I didn't add commentary. I didn't underline anything. I didn't frame it as a complaint. I submitted the documentation as required, clean and complete, like someone who understood the value of precision. When I finished, I checked everything once more, not out of doubt, but out of respect for what I was setting in motion. This wasn't an emotional act. It was procedural. It would move forward without me, regardless of how anyone felt about it. That was the point. I chose the timing carefully, close enough to their departure that everything was already in place, far enough that nothing could be undone quietly. They had rushed, they had committed. Their confidence had narrowed their options without them noticing. If I had acted earlier, the consequences would have been smaller, easier to manage, easier to explain away. I wanted none of that. I pressed submit and closed my laptop. There was no immediate response, no confirmation that felt dramatic or final, just a brief acknowledgement that the materials had been received and would be reviewed, the kind of message people overlook because it sounds routine. I didn't reread it. I didn't sit there waiting for something to happen. I stood up, rinsed my coffee cup, and put it in the sink. I went about my day the same way I always had. That was harder than I expected. Not because I felt guilt, but because I felt nothing at all. No surge of satisfaction, no fear, just a steady calm, the kind that comes after a decision has already been made and accepted. I went to work. I answered emails. I laughed at the right moments. I didn't check my phone more than usual. There was nothing to check yet. The process had its own rhythm, and impatience wouldn't speed it up. When Alex texted me later to say things were moving quickly and he might be home late, I replied with a single word. Okay. That was the last thing I said about it. The hours stretched. Evening came and went. The house filled with familiar sounds. I cooked dinner and packed leftovers into containers, labeling them the way I always did. The normalcy felt almost ceremonial, a closing of one chapter without announcing the next. When Alex came home, he was relaxed, lighter than he had been in weeks. He talked about logistics, about how relieved he was that everything had finally lined up. He didn't notice how carefully I listened, how little I spoke. I asked him if he was tired. He said he was exhausted in the good way, the way you feel when the hard part is over. I nodded. Later, lying in bed beside him, I stared into the dark and felt the weight of what I had done settle fully. There would be no taking it back, no clarifying conversation, no chance to soften the landing. Whatever happened next would happen because of choices already made. His, not mine. That distinction mattered to me. I hadn't taken anything from him. I hadn't interfered with his plans. I had simply stopped protecting the lie that allowed them to exist without consequence. The silence after submission stretched into something taut and expectant. I knew the review wouldn't be instant. I also knew it wouldn't be gentle. Systems don't rush, but they don't forget either. The next morning, Alex left again with the same confidence, unaware that the ground beneath that confidence had shifted. He kissed me goodbye and said he'd call later. I told him to drive safely. It wasn't goodbye. It wasn't anything like that. It was just the last moment before the door closed quietly behind him, and the process I had activated continued on its own, indifferent to explanations or apologies. By the time anyone noticed something was wrong, it would already be too late to trace it back to me. I didn't need to be present when that happened. I didn't need to watch. I had done the only thing I intended to do, and in doing it, I stepped out of the role they had written for me. Whatever came next would no longer require my silence. It would require their accountability. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't a confrontation or an accusation. It was a pause. Alex stood in the hallway with his phone pressed to his ear, his expression fixed in that practiced calm he used when he expected reassurance on the other end. He waited, nodded once, then frowned slightly. When the call ended, he didn't move right away. He stared at the screen as if it had failed him. I noticed the hesitation before he did. Normally, conversations with his lawyer were quick and efficient. A question, an answer, a solution. This time, there was no immediate return call, no confident follow-up, just a stretch of silence that didn't fit the rhythm they had established. At first, he brushed it off. "He's probably tied up," Alex said casually, more to himself than to me. He poured a glass of water, checked his messages, and sent a short text. His tone was relaxed, but something in his shoulders had shifted. The silence lingered. Over the next day, the mood in the house changed. Not dramatically, not enough that someone unfamiliar would notice. But I had lived with Alex long enough to recognize the signs. His movements became sharper, his conversations shorter. He checked his phone more often, not with anticipation this time, but with impatience. His family sensed it too. Calls that had once been filled with confident planning grew clipped. Voices dropped. Conversations ended abruptly when I entered the room, not because they were hiding something new, but because they were trying to decide how much to reveal about what they didn't yet understand. No one said the word problem. No one needed to. When the lawyer finally did call back, it wasn't the conversation Alex had expected. I wasn't close enough to hear details, but I didn't need to be. I watched Alex's face change as he listened. The ease drained from his expression, replaced by a tight concentration I hadn't seen before. There were no raised voices, no dramatic gestures, just a slow, controlled response, as if he were trying to maintain authority over a situation that was slipping away. "Yes," he said at one point. Then again, more carefully, "I understand." When the call ended, he sat down without saying anything. The glass of water in his hand remained untouched. That was when I knew the clause had been triggered. The lawyer's reaction wasn't panic. It was restraint. The kind that comes when someone realizes they are no longer in a position to smooth things over. When explanations are replaced by procedures and optimism by caution. Alex didn't tell me what the call had been about. He didn't need to. The tension spoke for him. His family started calling more frequently, their voices layered with concern now instead of confidence. Questions were asked in fragments. Answers were incomplete. Something was moving beneath them, and they couldn't see its shape yet. At dinner that night, conversation felt forced. Alex barely ate. His mother asked if everything was all right, her tone too light to be convincing. He nodded and said it was fine, but no one seemed reassured. I stayed quiet. This was not the moment to speak. Over the next few days, the cracks widened. Plans that had been solid became conditional, timelines blurred. The word delay surfaced, first tentatively, then more often. Each time it was used, it carried less certainty. I watched panic travel through the family the way rumors do, unevenly and without coordination. One person worried about documents, another about accounts. Someone asked whether everything had been done correctly. No one wanted to admit the possibility that something fundamental had been overlooked. The lawyer's name came up repeatedly, always with a question attached. When they finally met with him in person, I didn't need to be in the room to understand what happened. Alex returned home quieter than I had ever seen him. His confidence, once so effortless, had been replaced by something brittle. The lawyer hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't accused. He had simply explained what had been activated and what that meant. Assets flagged, movements reviewed. A process that could not be hurried or negotiated away. Alex tried to regain control that night by pacing, by making calls, by reassuring his family that it was a misunderstanding. But his words didn't carry the same weight anymore. The plan they had trusted was no longer theirs to manage. Through all of it, no one asked me anything directly. They didn't ask how I knew. They didn't ask when I found out. They didn't ask if I had done something. To do so would have meant acknowledging the plan itself, and none of them were ready for that. Instead, they moved around me carefully, as if unsure whether I was dangerous or irrelevant. I said nothing. By the end of the week, it was clear that there would be no quiet resolution. Whatever had been set in motion was too far along. The lawyer's silence between calls said more than any explanation could have. They were still trying to fix the plan. They hadn't realized yet that there was nothing left to fix. I watched it unfold from the same place I had always occupied, present, composed, unremarkable. And in that stillness I felt something settle permanently. They had believed silence was on their side. Now it belonged to me. The day they were supposed to leave arrived without ceremony. Suitcases stood by the door, zipped and upright, like obedient witnesses. Alex moved through the house with forced efficiency, checking his phone, glancing at the clock, repeating the timeline out loud as if saying it often enough would make it hold. His family arrived in small waves, each person carrying the same tight smile, the same insistence that everything was under control. I watched from the edge of the room, unnoticed. At the airport, the atmosphere shifted the moment we stepped inside. It wasn't dramatic, no alarms, no raised voices, just a pause where momentum should have been, a request to wait, a polite explanation that something needed verification. Alex nodded, confident. "That's fine," he said. "We have time." Time was the one thing they didn't have. Minutes stretched into something heavier, phones came out, messages were sent. Alex paced, then stopped pacing, then paced again. His sister asked what the delay was about. He told her it was routine, his voice steady but thinner than before. Routine has a sound when it stops being true. The gate area filled with movement around us, families boarding, couples saying goodbye, announcements echoing overhead. But our small group remained fixed in place. The contrast was unmistakable. Everyone else was moving forward. We were not. Another request came, another wait. This time, Alex didn't smile. He stepped aside to make a call, his back turned, his voice lowered. I couldn't hear what was being said, but I saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his free hand clenched and unclenched. When he returned, his face had changed, not panicked, not yet, but alert in a way that betrayed uncertainty. "Just a delay," he said again too quickly. "Nothing serious." No one believed him. The questions started quietly. His mother asked if there was an issue with documentation. His sister asked whether the lawyer had mentioned anything about timing. Alex deflected, told them not to worry, but his answers no longer carried authority. Time kept passing. A uniformed employee approached, professional and calm, and asked Alex to step aside. The conversation that followed was brief and unreadable from a distance, but when Alex came back, his confidence was gone. His eyes flicked toward me, then away, as if checking for something he couldn't quite name. They were told there would be no boarding. Not today. The explanation was technical, polite, carefully worded. Something about verification, about assets under review, about procedures that couldn't be expedited. There was no accusation, no scene to react to, just a closed door presented as policy. For the first time, Alex raised his voice. He demanded to speak to someone else. He asked how long this would take. He insisted there had to be a mistake. The responses didn't change. Systems don't bend for urgency, and they don't respond to frustration. I stood there, quiet and still, as the realization spread through the group. This wasn't a delay, it was a stop. His sister argued under her breath. His mother stared at the floor. Someone asked if they should call the lawyer again. Alex already was. This time, the call didn't connect at all. That was when the truth landed. Not all at once, but in fragments. In the way Alex stopped trying to manage the room. In the way no one looked at each other directly anymore. In the way their voices dropped, not to hide, but because there was nothing left to say. They had planned an exit. What they were getting instead was an accounting. Eyes turned toward me, cautiously, as if I might offer something. An explanation, a reaction, a clue. I gave them none. I wasn't angry, I wasn't vindictive, I wasn't even curious about what would happen next. I already knew. After a while it became clear there was nothing more to do there, no appeal, no workaround, no quiet solution. The gate emptied, the day moved on without them. I didn't follow when they gathered their bags. I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. I simply stepped away from the circle they were forming, the tight knot of panic and disbelief. I walked toward the exit alone, my pace unhurried, my phone silent in my hand. Outside, the air felt different, lighter, not because something good had happened, but because something false had finally stopped moving. Alex didn't call out to me. Maybe he didn't know what to say. Maybe he still believed this could be fixed. That if he could just get someone on the line, just explain, just buy a little more time, everything would fall back into place. But plans that rely on silence don't survive scrutiny. I got into my car and sat there for a moment before turning the key. There was no rush, no destination I needed to reach quickly. Whatever they were facing now would take time, attention, and answers they weren't prepared to give. I drove away knowing the departure they had imagined was over. What remained was something far less convenient. And for the first time since the anniversary dinner, I felt no need to listen anymore. After everything collapsed, no one asked me how I knew. The days that followed were not loud. There were no dramatic confrontations, no slammed doors, no declarations of guilt or innocence. Instead, there was an uneasy quiet that settled over everything, the kind that follows a mistake too large to name. Alex moved through the house differently now, cautious in ways he had never been before, as if the walls might be listening. The calls started soon after. At first, they came from Alex, short check-ins disguised as concern. Was I okay? Did I need anything? His voice lacked its old confidence, the certainty that had once shaped every decision. I answered politely and briefly, giving him nothing to push against. Then the calls came from his family. They didn't ask direct questions, they circled them. His sister asked whether I'd noticed anything strange lately. His mother wondered aloud if I thought the lawyer might be overreacting. Each conversation felt like an attempt to locate the source of the damage without naming it. I listened, I said very little. What none of them could bring themselves to ask was the only question that mattered. They didn't ask when I had realized what was happening. They didn't ask whether I had taken action. To ask would have meant admitting the plan itself, acknowledging that they had coordinated something that should never have existed. Silence protected them from that admission. And it protected me from having to explain. I could feel the shift in how they looked at me, even when they pretended nothing had changed. Their glances lingered a moment too long. Their tone carried a new restraint. I was no longer invisible, but I wasn't openly accused either. I occupied a space that made them uncomfortable, one they didn't know how to address. The woman they had prepared everything for disappeared from conversation entirely. No one mentioned her name. No one asked where she was or what she planned to do now. Whatever she had represented before, a future, an escape, a solution, had turned into a liability. The plan that had once revolved around her now avoided her completely. I didn't need to confront her. I didn't need answers from her. The truth had already done its work. What became clear in those weeks was how fragile control really was. Alex had always believed authority came from making decisions, from staying one step ahead, from managing information. When that structure failed, so did the confidence built on top of it. He began asking my opinion on small things, dinner plans, scheduling, mundane decisions that had once been automatic. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't humility, it was uncertainty, searching for stability where he could find it. I didn't offer what he was looking for. There was a moment, late one evening, when he finally tried to say something that resembled a question. He asked if I thought things would work themselves out. The way he said it suggested he was hoping I might reassure him, might soften whatever had been triggered. I looked at him and told him I didn't know. That was the truth. The hardest part for them wasn't the legal consequences or the delays or the scrutiny. It was the loss of narrative. They no longer controlled the story. They didn't know who knew what or how much or why. They were forced into a position they had never planned for, accountability without a clear opponent. I watched it happen from a distance I hadn't known I could create. There was a strange peace in that distance. Not satisfaction, not victory, just the absence of pressure. I wasn't required to fix anything. I wasn't obligated to soothe their fears or help them regain their footing. For the first time, their problems were not mine to manage. I thought about how often I had been told over the years that I was easy to live with, how that had been framed as a compliment, how easily it had been mistaken for weakness. I understood now that control doesn't always look like force. Sometimes it looks like assumption. And the moment those assumptions fail, everything built on them becomes unstable. They wanted explanations. What they needed was responsibility. I didn't owe them clarity. I didn't owe them reassurance. I didn't even owe them confrontation. The truth was already present, woven into the consequences they were facing, and it didn't require my voice to be heard. When the house finally grew quiet again, when the calls slowed and the questions stopped circling, I felt something settle that had nothing to do with revenge. It was ownership. I had stepped out of the role they assigned me without announcing it, without asking permission, without leaving behind a trail they could follow. The silence that once worked against me now worked in my favor. Not as a weapon, but as a boundary. They could keep wondering how it had happened. I already knew. And knowing that, without needing to explain it to anyone, was enough. I didn't leave the house that night to escape anything. I stayed because for the first time, There was nothing pressing against my chest, nothing demanding that I fix it, smooth it over, or pretend it wasn't happening. The silence felt earned, not empty, earned. Alex slept on the far edge of the bed, facing away from me. He didn't ask questions anymore. The uncertainty had finally settled in, replacing confidence with caution. Whatever future he had imagined no longer included shortcuts or quiet exits. It required explanations now, documentation, time. All the things he had once believed he could manage without me. In the days that followed, I watched the world return to its normal rhythm. Work emails arrived, bills were paid, groceries were restocked. Life, remarkably indifferent, kept moving forward. The difference was subtle but permanent. I no longer moved around other people's decisions. I had my own center now. There was no dramatic confrontation to conclude this story, no confession, no courtroom scene, no raised voice declaring victory. The outcome was quieter than that, and more complete. Alex stopped talking about plans. His family stopped calling. The future they had been building in secret dissolved under the weight of its own design, not because I destroyed it, but because I stepped out of the way and let it collapse on its own terms. That distinction mattered to me. Revenge is often imagined as something sharp and visible, something that announces itself. But what I learned was this: the most effective reckoning doesn't require spectacle. It requires clarity. The clarity to recognize when silence is no longer protection, and when action doesn't need an audience. I didn't take anything from them. I didn't expose them publicly. I didn't demand apologies or explanations. I simply stopped shielding a lie that depended on my compliance to survive. And once that shield was gone, everything they had built around it failed naturally. I packed a small bag a few weeks later, not to run, not to disappear, just to create space. Alex didn't argue. He didn't ask where I was going. He understood finally that this wasn't something he could negotiate. The door closed softly behind me. As I drove away, I thought about how many times I had been told that staying quiet was strength, that patience was maturity, that understanding meant accepting decisions made without you. I know better now. Strength is knowing when silence is being used against you. Maturity is choosing timing over impulse. Understanding is recognizing that you don't have to scream to be heard. Sometimes you just have to stop standing in the way of the truth. This story didn't end with punishment. It ended with balance. With me reclaiming authorship of my own life. If you've ever felt invisible inside your own marriage, your own family, your own story, if you've ever been underestimated because you chose calm over chaos, remember this: quiet doesn't mean powerless. It never did. Sometimes the most decisive moment is the one where you do exactly one thing and let everything else reveal itself. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, your experiences, your reflections, or even the questions you're still holding on to. And if you want to stay with stories like this, stories about hidden power, quiet strength, and the moment the tables finally turn, make sure to subscribe and stay with the channel. There are more stories coming. And sometimes the quiet ones say the most. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.